Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next session of CME Palooza Fall. My name is Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to our next session entitled My Data Wants Out, see with the exclamation point. This session is sponsored by Integrity CE and Medscape. Our moderator for this session, who will introduce herself shortly, is Angelique Vinther. Angelique is a freelance data and outcomes consultant. So as with all of our CME Palooza sessions, I'd like to first start by acknowledging and thanking all of our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Academy for Continuing Healthcare Learning, Clinical Education Alliance, and Med Learning Group, our silver sponsors, Academic CME, EKB Med, Haymarket Medical Education, Helio CME, Integrity Continuing Education, Medscape Education, Platform Q Health Education, Red Med Ed, and Talem Health. And finally, our many bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, Antidote Education Company, Bonum Continuing Education, CME Institute, CMEology, Hippocrates, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Infograph Ed, Integritas Communications, Iridium Continuing Education, MedIQ, Partners for Advancing Clinical Education, PriMed, Peerview Institute for Medical Education, RMEI Medical Education, Vindico Medical Education, and Wright Medicine. So there are two ways to ask questions during this and all of our CME Palooza sessions. You can use the CME Palooza text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME. That's 0263. Or if you open up the viewing window in YouTube by clicking on Watch on YouTube in the lower left-hand corner of our live page, you can enter in questions within the YouTube chat function. We'll get to as many questions as we can throughout the session. We don't hold them until the end. So if you have a question, hopefully we'll get to it within a couple of minutes. So we have audience response questions during this and all of our CME Palooza sessions. So to interact with our audience response system, we use Poll Everywhere. So this is being sponsored this year by CME Outfitters. So you can either download the Poll Everywhere app and join the presentation entitled CME Palooza 005, or type the following URL in your web browser, www.pollev.com/CME Palooza 005. We have a few questions at the beginning of the session and then a couple more kind of as we're going along. So finally, our speakers' disclosures. Please note that the opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, its parent company, or their affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Angelique to get us started.
Thanks, Scott. Well, welcome everyone again to CME Palooza's second session, My Data Wants Out. I'm Angelique Vinther. I'm an independent data and outcomes consultant. I've been in the CME industry for about 15 years. And I currently work with a variety of organizations, helping them make sense of all the data they're collecting and try to pull a story out of all the data sets that we're currently compiling for different educational activities, and how to present a story and distill a message for their various stakeholders. I'm joined today by an expert panel, and we're going to dig into a few different challenges we all face in terms of methods that we use, and really just trying to pull the signal from the noise when we're collecting data on all our educational activities. I'm just going to go first name alphabetical. So let's start with Ann Rock, if you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ann. I'm an Associate Director at Takeda U.S. Medical Grants and Sponsorships. I put together IME strategy. I review and manage the grants and budgets and outcomes reports, specifically in neuroscience and immunology. So I will take a look at every single report that comes in, and if there's opportunity to provide a summary of them, I'll share them with senior leadership and the medical leads, or walk through the reports depending on the time that I'll have with the internal stakeholders. I've been in CME for 17 years. 14 of them were at companies on the MEX side.
Yes, you got a nice view from both sides, which will be helpful for today's discussion. Baval, what about you?
Hi, I'm Bavel Shah. I am president and co-founder at Infograph Ed. We are a visual medical communications company where we provide visual and design solutions, interactive solutions for medical education, as well as outcomes reports and so on. Here at Infograph Ed, I head up the creative and design team, which are also scientists who have a mix of science and design backgrounds, so they understand the data that they're using before they visualize it. I've been in the CME industry for on and off for over 15 years, including some time on the pharma side as well. Nice to meet you.
Thanks. Yeah. And Emily, how about you?
Hi, I'm Emily Belcher. I am the Director of Research and Analytics at CE Outcomes. We're an independent research company. We work with data on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis. Anything spans from our needs assessments to impact studies, where we're really trying to look at the impact of education, sometimes with one similar instrument across multiple different educations. Also, we work on individual outcomes from programs, and then also aggregation. So just a lot of data. And sometimes that's going to publications like manuscripts and posters. And sometimes the audience is the provider or the supporter. And so really just getting to what is needed to communicate why it matters to each of your audience members.
That's great. And we want to learn a little bit about our audience that we have this morning too. So thank you to Derek and Scott for having us and also helping us kind of facilitate some of the tech while we go through the presentation. So Scott, if you want to queue up the first question, we kind of have two in a row. One is more targeted to people who provide education. So how are outcomes reports compiled at your organization? As a shared task or team effort, a dedicated person, outsourced to a vendor, or this is not a function that your organization performs? We'll give that a couple seconds to come in. And then after that, we actually have a question that's more focused towards the supporters or funders in our space. Looks like it's clicking along there. It's interesting to see, how it comes in. So there's a lot of people that are really doing outcomes work as kind of a shared task. That's interesting. Okay, Scott, we can go ahead and go to the next question. So if you are in the supporter or funder side, how are outcomes shared internally at your organization? Kind of one report at a time. Whatever the provider is giving you, one report at a time with just like highlighted or selected slides, aggregated across reports, and just metrics only, or aggregated with metrics and then some sort of, like theme or domain that you're looking at, like regions or specialty, things like that. Okay. Kind of watching that come in. So it's interesting to see how the distribution, of responses here. And Anne, I know that second question was one that you helped me add to our list. So getting a sense of, kind of how disparate the processes for creating and presenting outcomes can be, kind of inside all these different organizations. What's one way you found helpful to getting the angle you need to position your programs? Anne, can you hear me okay?
So it's interesting that the last choice was chosen by the majority of supporter respondents. So I would actually like to be able to have conversations with you, learn from you. So when I have to summarize across my grants, like for example, for quarterly or end of year reports, for the therapeutic area medical leads or to share with senior leadership, Unfortunately, right now, we don't have the means to truly aggregate across reports. And by data, I'm referring to like level 3 outcomes and above. It'd be great if we can get de-identified raw data, but first we'll need to work with our ethics and compliance colleagues and legal colleagues. So the next best thing that I do is to look at the reports in terms of how they're aligned with our specific internal medical objectives, and to summarize the higher level outcomes and group them that way. So my TAs usually have 2 to 4 medical objectives per year. So for example, like I'll group the level 3 and 4 outcomes to something like X number of IME activities, covered discussions that increase knowledge on disease burden and unmet needs, or something like that, or X number of activities increased competence on evidence-based treatment planning, etc. So that's how I can get around doing the broad strokes for higher level outcomes. I'll also list the outcomes levels achieved, the proposed and actual number of learners and completers by specialty, the format, if the activity was at a live conference or online. Now, most of those more basic metrics can be pulled from our grant portal, so it's easier to be able to provide them in a summary form. But I also add in anything unique about the activities, like if it's tied to real world outcomes, if there were partnerships with advocacy groups or medical organizations, or if a publication was involved. And these kind of details, of course, elevate the work that we do and emphasize the value of CME and the type of information that can come in apart from just your standard reporting. So I do that for my summary reports that are, like I said, quarterly or end of year. I also share single reports in full as they're given to me by providers. But when I present them to cross-functional colleagues in like a large group meeting, I'll probably usually curate the slides from the full report so that they're aligned with the specific medical objectives, because I only have like sometimes 10 to 20 minutes for when I get to have my IME time with the whole team.
Yeah, and that's, I think, really important for people who are putting reports together to understand in terms of making the data like really transparent and navigable, because you are going to be probably gleaning certain slides out. You mentioned both like levels, like, 3 and 4, like Morris levels, also kind of themes. Do you think that, would you say that you spend more time kind of talking, because questions can be knowledge or competence, right? And kind of lumped together under certain themes. Do you focus more on those themes? Or do you focus more on like whether knowledge or competence is being addressed?
I'll try to do both if I can across grants. Sometimes it's really difficult. Like other times it's easy to identify questions that can be categorized in a particular bucket, and I'll put it in and I'll just put a caveat that says, look, I'm not able to actually merge these data truly. There's variance between each of these reports, but on an eyeball, you could see that there are a lot more, bigger gaps or bigger gains in knowledge or competency for a specific theme or domain. I'm hoping that one day we'll be, one day soon actually, now with like, with data and analytics internally to be able to help us pull in the data and have the story be able to have more meaningful storytelling.
Yeah. If like, as just kind of a follow-up to that, like what's one thing providers could do that would be kind of helpful for you in terms of like facilitating the way that you want to highlight or aggregate, for your presentations? Like, is there anything that, individual providers could do to kind of help that along?
Yeah, keep in mind that it's not going to always be somebody with experience in CME who's going to be seeing the report. So I would be mindful of limiting like CME speak, like, Moore's level 3B. Instead of writing that down, I change those to change in procedural knowledge. So if you can do that instead of me, that saves a little bit of time. Adding a little bit more about the learners is appreciated. what we can capture in the grant portal are things like specialty and number of credits and learners. But it also would be great to be able to get a greater understanding of where they are practicing, their years in practice, patient load, geographic location, things like that. And then for reports that have activities that are both live and have an enduring component, it's nice to be able to see the live and enduring responses side by side. Sometimes they're really far apart, or I'll get like a live report and then an enduring report, and I'll have to actually pull them together myself. So those like little things save me time. That'll be helpful.
Okay, yeah, that's several points of good advice. We wanted to do one more polling question because we want to kind of have an idea of what the audience tends to struggle with too. So Scott, polling question number 3, what would you say is the biggest outcomes challenge you're currently facing? So like the nuts and bolts, just the sheer lift of collecting, analyzing, and reporting the basics, interpretation of the results, finding the story amidst all the collected metrics, visualizations, how to choose charts and graphs that or artwork that best illustrate your message, the frequency, just like keeping up with all the reporting timelines and requirements, or other. Okay, I'm getting some good feedback there. Data interpretation is a pretty common pain point for a lot of providers. All this data is collected, and now we have to analyze, organize, present it in a way that highlights the accomplishments of the program and speaks to its educational design, and hopefully says something unique, about your intervention. Emily, I wanted to direct a question to you. Once you've accounted for all the expected metrics, what are some of the first things that you do as a way to look for ways to kind of pull the story out or distill a message? How do you want to best position it?
Absolutely. So as we all know, data storytelling isn't just about reporting the numbers. You really have to communicate, why is this relevant? And one of the key things is actually going back to the beginning, going back to remember what was the reason for this education. If it's, for example, for an education, what were the learning objectives and why? And then what questions did we ask around the learning objectives? And when you're designing your outcomes, you really should be writing those questions to address those learning objectives and make sure that you're seeing where movement was made there. And so that's really the beginning of your story. If you're doing enduring outcomes, you might even be watching the data as you're collecting, which will really help you as well. Not only just pivot your program if you need to, but also with that story, kind of seeing it unfold. But I will say that you can't stick to what you think is going to happen when you're planning your program, because sometimes when you get the outcomes, you might see a different story unfold. And so it's not like you're going from the beginning and you already know your story. You really have to be ready to pivot and make sure that it's clear. Another thing is in storytelling, in data reporting itself, often things kind of go either one or the other. Sometimes it's too much information and it's just an overload. And sometimes people try to cut it down and it becomes not enough information. And so if you go through and you start trying to tell your story and you're like, hey, we made these movements and this is, the impact we saw and it's huge and it's great and everything. And then you go to the end and you see that the audience was somebody who you didn't think it was. Let's say that there's a bunch of industry in there, or the audience was all physicians and you thought this program was for NPPAs. You just really have to be careful about making sure that you're putting in all that relevant information and really not losing the context of it as well.
Yeah, that's a helpful thing to think about. And I know that a lot of providers have been thinking more over the last few years about, instead of reports just being kind of a perfunctory data dump, right? They're trying to craft more of a story, and they're trying to, highlight the impact for the audience so that they're not having to dig through the metrics and find it for themselves. And being on kind of the receiving end of some providers that are trying to craft a story for you, how helpful do you feel like that is? Does the provider basically offering up an angle or a story for their education, is that pretty helpful? Or do you feel like you're still ending up having to dig down into the raw data and find things for yourself?
Oh, stories that are presented by providers are certainly very helpful. I think a narrative will orient me faster, remind me about the problem, what's changed for learners after the intervention, and tying it back to the patients, what those changes mean to patients. I think that's fantastic if a report can tell me that. Also, I'd say that reports that have a compelling narrative get told. They're easier to remember and present, and they also tend to get more questions when I present them, which are great because that leads to cross-functional discussions and collaborations with teams outside of my colleagues in the grants teams. And of course, that just elevates the value of IME more. To me, having a narrative from the provider is a better starting point. It's easier to see where our internal medical objectives might fit. And I might still inject some of my own storytelling so it resonates with the interests of the medical team, but usually the heart of the narrative stays. There have been instances where I've been asked for, or I've asked information for providers that's not included in the report. So like I know a medical objective, for example, is focused on a profession or specialty. I might ask to see if they can send me data with those specific HCPs in mind, and provided that the sample size is large enough. So, for example, recent example, the needs and practice behaviors of infusion therapy nurses and pharmacists are going to be different from non-IT HCPs. And if providers can send me that sub-data, I'll be able to add in my own story that's going to be relevant for the internal stakeholders and present that along with a part of what the full report narrative is selling.
Yeah, and I personally always welcome those follow-up questions anytime I see them from supporters, because one, it means that they're really looking at the data and they've spent some time thinking about it, because now they've got those follow-up questions where they want to dig a little deeper, they want to kind of take a look at a cohort or subset of the learner group. So yeah, I always find that helpful. It also helps me as a provider on the provider side, kind of understand better like what they're looking for, like what the interest is and things like that, because sometimes, especially for myself, like being on the outcome side of things, I'm coming to some of the programs pretty late in the game, and it's a little bit of a game of catch up to figure out, okay, what was needed here? Why was the intervention designed the way it was? What were we trying to accomplish? And how to highlight that best throughout the report. So when I get a couple of those little follow-up questions of like, hey, can we, kind of highlight this piece or look a little deeper into that? It always helps me kind of understand like how that data is being used and looked at. One important thing too, when we're trying to distill our message, and it's, basically how can we tell our story visually? And when we're incorporating visualizations, it's, important to think beyond, charting and graphing of basic survey data. Balo, can you speak to some of the ways that visualizations can highlight or actually provide deeper insights as opposed to, just like I said, charting and graphing what we can kind of already glean from a table?
Absolutely. And I know this is a panel discussion, but of course, when I'm talking about visuals and visualization techniques, it makes sense to show some slides. So Scott, thank you. I have some slides up here.
And we actually do have a question too that you might want to touch on while you're going through your slides is what resources can we use to do better illustrative visuals for data? Is it always just Excel? So you may be already prepared to touch on that, but since that one kind of came in on visualizations, I thought I'd throw that out to you.
That's great. Thank you. So yeah, we here use PowerPoint quite a lot for visualization and storytelling. You can do that with PowerPoint and then Excel and don't need much more. And all the examples I'm going to share with you here in a few minutes are all created in those two programs and nothing more. So to help you better tell your story using visualizations, furthering on from just simply charts and graphs, we tend to use these 7 essential principles of better storytelling, which are these essential principles written by an author called Brent Dykes. I have a book here. I don't know if you can see it. We really use his principles and guide us in our storytelling techniques. I'm going to show those here. These are, you can see, broken up into the left and right sides. And the left side, which is the setup, and the principles listed under the setup are really what would help you tell your story. This setup these principles under the setup are really what will explain your storytelling further from just simple bars and charts. The right side has principles that will help make that story look better and focus attention and so on. But if we start with the left, you're kind of in the right place. So I have some examples here. These are just sample slides. And you can see, let's just say you are presenting in a cross-functional team and you are presenting your educational plan to a team, and which will then be followed on with the outcomes that you propose to hopefully get at the end. You might have this sort of slide, your educational strategies, and spoke about trying to bring a cohesive story together. So let's say you're using these educational strategies to do so, and you might have a slide like this where each of your strategy is aligned with something with the Moore's model, for example. And you mentioned that CME speak, absolutely. Let's say you're presenting this in a cross-functional team setting, you might want to use their language. So in this case, we have a Pathman model instead, and you're aligning your strategies simply with the Pathman model, same sort of thing. But what we're using here is the principle of the right calibration. So you're speaking to your internal audience and you're using the right type of visual and their speak to meet their needs. The other thing that we do is we focus attention. So in this case, just simple visual elements of saturation of color to show where they are as an audience that you, learners that you hope to reach, and where you want them to be, just by color and saturation brings attention to those areas. And then making the data more approachable, or the information that you're presenting more approachable. So in this case, the use of icons and grouping everything together in that strategy kind of makes sense. Another example here is, when you have these aggregate outcomes by specialty. We talked about aggregate outcomes. Let's say you're presenting pre and post test information like this. Well, this is all fine and good, but you can have the same slide presented in this way using these principles, the right data. So in this case, instead of simply showing pre and post as the color choices, we actually used specialty as our color choices to tease apart that information. So you can see at the bottom here, specialty 1 to PCPs and managed care are all different colors. Now you can really start to tease us apart and see the insights. So visualization, I want to stress, is not just about making things look good, but it also helps you see those insights easier. And that's one of the main things we're trying to explain here, is when you have aggregate outcomes and you have all this information, you're trying to see what are the insights. Visualizing it in a specific way will make you see those insights really clearly. Another one is the right data. So in this case, we're ensuring that we are presenting those specialties separated out, as I mentioned. We are also including the N numbers. They weren't there in the previous slide. This will help you with insights as well. And then we're also removing the noise from the slides from previously, and so on. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, but as you can see, one of the main things we've done here visually is also use focused attention. So these color-coded call-outs will give you that insight, the fact that specialty 2 needs some help, that they're struggling, managed care are doing really well, and maybe we've recruited too many primary care and we need to reassess our plans moving forward, something like that. This is just an example. And then these are some steps and solutions based on that, and what we call the aha moments from having visualized that slide and understood the impact and the main points of focus, and we have our aha moments. So I'll stop there because I know there's a lot more to be discussed, but these are just some examples, and the principles that we use really help us tell the story.
That's great. Yeah, I really like the emphasis on always displaying your end values. That's always a good point to make for everybody and a good reminder for everybody all the time. I also like how in the graphic that you showed that was showing kind of the growth between the different cohorts, the specialties, that everything is anchored to scale, right? So everything is the same, like 0 to 100. You're comparing apples to apples across it. So when you see one movement that's more, steep than the other one, that that's actually like real. It's a good comparison. So
Exactly.
that was really helpful way to kind of look at new ways to demonstrate the data so that it's more than just, charting the data we have, but using the visualization to kind of help us with our own insights. We have one last polling question for the audience. Scott, if you would like to queue up question 4. When discussing future educational opportunities with supporters or providers, this is kind of for everybody, how integral are outcomes to these discussions? Is that something like very integral, it drives the discussion somewhat, very little, or not at all? And then while they're answering, I did see a question come in through the chat from Scott. Somebody brought up the distinction between storytelling and narrative. The rationale being is that we've seen stories that can deviate from real evidence. And so do any of you guys have a preference around like the terminology of storytelling versus narrative, or do you kind of distinguish between them? I kind of use both interchangeably, but I thought it was an interesting question while we're, kind of waiting
I
for
would-
everyone to comment if there's like any kind of difference that you guys identify between the terms of narrative versus storytelling.
Yeah, to me, those are interchangeable too. I'm not sure I ever thought of them as different terms.
I think I see the difference, but I think for what we usually, do, hopefully you're not losing the evidence and the actual data behind it. Hopefully you're not, embellishing things too much. So I think that, for data reporting, it's outcomes reporting. Hopefully it's the same thing regardless.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully in our space, it means the same thing, but I do understand like how the word story can kind of have a different feel to that word than narrative. Okay. So it's nice to see some of that come in. It looks like the bulk of people, use it pretty heavily, but it may not be like the main thing that they're, going in to discuss, which obviously makes sense. So that's good to see. I think one last kind of like main topic that I want to cover is, and it doesn't get discussed nearly enough, but I think it's really important to consider our audience when we're designing our outcomes presentations. And based on like kind of time crunch and the rush and the load that we're all dealing with, is we often think that like one template or one report can serve all of our needs. But some stakeholders, to Anne's point earlier too, some are going to be really focused on the metrics and they're going to want to dig down into the weeds, and they're going to be really like well-versed in CME terms and statistical terms and things like that. And they want to understand the methodologies for collection and analysis. And others are going to want more of kind of like high level takeaways. And they're not going to have time for like really lengthy, detailed tours of the finer points. I thought it would be a good place to start with you, Emily. Like, how do you manage this from a reporting presentation kind of planning perspective? Kind of knowing your audience and tailoring what it is you're putting together, because sometimes it is a complex message and it takes some time, but you also kind of know you've got like X amount of time to get that message communicated, right?
Yeah. So I would say the first thing is any information that you can possibly get from discussions, conversations, or just from experience of working with that person previously, if you've had it. But I will also say that most, if we're talking about supporters here, most supporters that I've worked with kind of prefer both for different reasons. And so the key is really making sure that you do have an executive summary that, like Anne said, isn't using too much of that CME language, that can be shared internally with other stakeholders within their company, other people, and communicate that and clearly tells the story the whole way through. But then also you're not wanting to lose that other information. And so having those other slides that really go into some of those more finer details that they might want to dig into is important. And then I would also say audience can also vary to things like scientific conferences, manuscripts. It can vary a lot. So really your audience is pretty important. Like, for example, if you are going to a scientific conference with a poster, then you don't want to lose it by overloading information into that poster. Your points are going to get lost. And it's the same thing for the executive summary. You might have a ton of data, but there's no way that the supporter, it's really hard for the supporter to then go take that data and kind of sift through it and pull out some things. If you're able to give them an executive summary that tells that story, then it's easier for them to then take that summary and share it or pull out what they need from it.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, it makes for some tough decisions sometimes, right? Like you have to make some executive choices about what to cut out and what to leave in. And sometimes the stuff that you're cutting out, actually, it's good data too. It's like, oh, I want to keep this in there because it's, it's good data and it shows up well, but it's not actually part of the story or narrative that you're building. So, you need to use some space wisely and kind of keep the audience on track to the message that you're trying to deliver. And to your point, Emily, I think it's a good thing to keep in mind from like poster presentations and things like that. I mean, how many have you seen that are so crammed with information that, you'd have to stand in front of it for like 10 minutes before you could figure out what it is that they're trying to tell you. So how do you make some of those like judgment calls, I guess? Like what sorts of things do you look for when you're saying, okay, we have a whole lot of information and thankfully a lot of it's good, but we can't cram it all into one executive summary slide or one poster design. So like, how do you kind of figure out what you're willing to jettison in order to preserve the story?
Yeah, so you really need to have focus. You need to go back and look, like I said, go back to the beginning and think about what your goal was and everything, and then where those movements were made. Even if you have a point that movement wasn't made on, that's still important to communicate. Movement wasn't made here and potentially why or what in the future you can do to address that. But you're really looking for those learning objectives to communicate specifically in the summary what changed because of the education, what impact it had, and really clearly communicate that. And so you might have had 5 learning objectives and then 3 that really made, you really saw those increases for that you want to highlight, or you highlight all 5 learning objectives and just the questions. So that's another thing, like aligning the pre-post, for example, if you're doing that to the learning objectives, is a great way to kind of cut down on the questions. You can have the questions on the other slides and the details of the questions and the responses, but you could maybe look at aligning that data to the learning objectives for your pre-post for them to then use with their internal team for that summary.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I know visualizations can be our ally in some of this too, in terms of when you have a complex idea or a lot of data to communicate in a short period of time or in a small space. But Val, do you have some ways that you like some go-to tricks basically that you tend to use where you're like, oh, when this particular piece of data needs to be, highlighted or demonstrated, some good ways to use visualizations to kind of cut through what would otherwise require maybe a lot of text?
Yeah, for sure. And again, I'm going to reach out and share my slides again because it is just the best way to show it. But in this example here, this is when time is limited. Something that's really important is to consider a data trailer. This is, again, an insight from Brent Dykes. I do urge you to buy that book. A storytelling arc typically involves these 4 steps that you can see here, from setting a hook, giving rising insight, the aha moment, and then the solutions and next steps. And you can see the aha moment being the main factor, obviously, when you have limited time. So let's just say that you could do this when you have that executive summary need. So typically on the left is that rising arc and the aha moment. But then if you flip it and you have that sort of inverted pyramid top-down approach, you can go for the most important information first. And then, as Emily said, the supporting information and documents can always be applied afterwards. So just a really quick example back to those slides I showed you. Let's say you wanted to show your plan right at the start, then how you executed on that and the insights all together. That could be tricky, and to do that all together in one slide can be accomplished squeezing some elements in there, of course, but then also if you see the steps and solutions and next steps based on the aha moments slide there, you can make those messages be that top-down effect. So then our next slide is an amalgamation of those 3 slides where the aha moment is the heading. It's what we call a message title that allows you to just read the message and you're already halfway there. And then you can see, okay, how did this come about with all the other information added in? As you can see, we added in the Pathman model in there as well to give you an understanding of strategically where you were, why you chose that, and then how you delivered on it. So this kind of gives you an example of if you start with a top-down idea, then you are able to really cut down quite a bit, choose a heading that makes sense, and then go from there.
Yeah, that's great. And do you find that that technique is useful when you've got limited time and you're presenting internally of like, starting with the conclusion and cut to the chase and then build in like kind of the supporting documentation beneath that in case you basically have time or get questions or whatever, but kind of start with the takeaway?
Oh, for sure. Because sometimes the medical team might give me 20 minutes, but discussions from other cross-functional colleagues may shrink that down to 5. So it is definitely helpful to be able to have the aha moment first and lead with that. I don't have my slides look as pretty as Pavel's, but it's maybe I'll start adapting some of them, those ideas. I do start with the executive summary that's provided to me by providers, and then I will just trim it out a little bit so that there's not a lot of text. The learning objectives, instead of the full learning objectives like statement, I'll shrink it down to like maybe 4 or 5 words that encapsulates that learning objective. Things so that just to make it a little bit easier to read in one slide.
That's great. Yeah. Just so that you can feel like you're getting to like the real takeaway or the meat of it. And then you've got the other documentation there, but it's kind of counterintuitive to people that, do think about putting the report together as a story because you want to start at the beginning and then get to the middle and then finish at the end. And sometimes we just, don't have the luxury of kind of pulling everybody through like the full narrative. So I think it's really helpful to think about, taking your main conclusions, the meat of it, the takeaway of it, the action item of it, and putting that up front and then kind of working backwards from there. I think that's great. To that point, when
so Angelique, I've got a good question on here that I just wanted to kind of pop in. 'Cause I don't know if you guys are seeing the YouTube comments. So this was a question that came over about simple visualization, and Babel, I don't know if you or somebody else on the team wants to take this. Basically talking about resources to help create simple visualization for those of us who aren't so artistically savvy. What suggestions do you have on kind of a good place to start for everyone?
Right. So everything I showed here is created in PowerPoint. Even line charts with those heavily exaggerated balls on the other ends, they're all just line charts, for example, or just shapes with text on it. So none of this requires anything more than PowerPoint and Excel. Even those arrow diagrams, they're all part of PowerPoint. And the other thing that I want to just really emphasize is PowerPoint these days, they come out with new updates all the time, and it behooves us to keep on top of those updates and to really understand the power of PowerPoint, because you can do a lot with it, and YouTube videos and so on will help you along as well. But I just do want to emphasize everything I showed here doesn't require a graphic design degree or anything of that sort. Of course, then if you have the ability to then brush up the visuals in a nice way, consistent colors, fonts, texts, and all that, then they'll look even better. And those are just some simple ways to make them look best afterwards. but you really don't need to be a graphic designer to do this.
So a few things that I really like implementing with PowerPoint is just simple shading, simple boxes to highlight some of those key things that you want to pull out so that the audience eyes very quickly goes to those points because they kind of need to know where to look on the screen. So that's helpful for that. And then a feature, Vival, that I like using, because you mentioned features, is the Zoom capability. And so sometimes I'll have like what I really, the main point on one slide, and then a zoom option for them to click on it, and it zooms them to the next slide and gives them further details, the extra information, or maybe additional data cuts that might be of interest, but isn't, they need to be introduced to the idea first. And so that's another feature if y'all haven't used it.
That's great. Thanks for bringing up the Emily bringing up the Zoom feature. I love that too. It also helps you put together a summary slide really easily. Just hide the other slides that create that summary, and then you can zoom in if you need that extra information.
And you also talked about some of the updates that you've been seeing that the software comes out with. Are you referring to functionalities like what you just described, or like sharper graphics, or like more design capabilities? Like what kind of updates have you been seeing?
All of the above. So Zoom,
Okay.
New, that was relatively new. I think it came out because of Prezi, to be honest with you. And then it's always coming out with new visuals as well as functionality. The other new thing we've been using a lot is maps. Maps is charts. All you need to do is put in a map, and then the values can be numbers, just as you would typically have, for example, attendance for states. Statewide attendance, and then color coding will happen automatically. So that's something that, in the old days we used to do by hand, but now I can do it just simply as a chart.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I know you and I had talked previously before about maps specifically from a graphics standpoint. Like I know that they're really appreciated. People always like them. They're pretty. They like to see them. For my purposes, I was like, I'll create them because I know that they add to kind of the aesthetic appeal of a report, but I don't feel like they're giving us a ton of information because usually everything is just kind of centered in the population centers around the country and things like that. And Vival, you made a really good point at the time about how you could use maps a little bit differently to tell us something a little bit more useful or more supporting of the story. Can you go into that just for a sec?
I can, yeah, thank you. So here is an example slide. Scott, I'm just showing one of my slides again of what you just said there, Angelique. This is typically what we see where the darker green, the greener green, I should say, is areas of higher attendance, let's just say, would be areas with, larger populations, California, Texas, Florida, New York. But what if you were to think about your visualization just a little bit more? What are you trying to explain? That your reach is reaching the right audiences, for example, in which case, let's say you were able to see the number of specialties you reached as a ratio of the total specialties in that area or in that state. In that case, you might have a completely different view. And in this case, you might see something like that. Again, I've got the right data here highlighted because that's the principle I'm looking at. Because now you might say, oh, well, we need to focus more in California after all, or something like that, because California has a higher number of specialties and we're only just scratching the surface, let's just say. So yes, you can use your maps in the way that you might think to use them, but actually this might be more useful.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Scott, did we have any more questions? I know we're getting kind of towards the end of our allotted time.
I think there was a couple of things that I put in the private chat. So let's, I think this one would be more for you, Anne, and I think you talked about it a little bit, but maybe if you want to elaborate on it. So the question is, when you were trying to merge outcomes data, how do you deal with the fact that some programs only ask general questions that don't specifically apply to your company's business interests?
I can't. That's the simple answer. So for grants that are multi-supported, for example, I might leave that data out, or I'll include it in and to see the general responses to a question, it's challenging. I think that if there usually is enough IME grants that I can pull and weave a story together across different reports, and they are definitely heterogeneous. For multi-support grants, that's more difficult, but this is where I lean towards the providers to really put together questions that are a little bit more specific, not as general, so that I can take that and bring it internally to my teams.
So one thing that with aggregation, so when you're aggregating across, let's say that a supporter is aggregating across and they're aggregating to their strategic objectives. There are some things like diagnosis and everything that applies across, but when you have a multi-support program, sometimes it's really difficult because there might be a lot of questions in there that might not be relevant to you. And so often it's pulling out those specific questions across the reports and aligning them to the strategic objective. But then you have those other questions that still give you an idea of where the audience is at. It can still give you a little bit of a taste, but it might not just be what you're really is important to you to provide back to that stakeholder. And so I think it's easier to do if you're looking at aggregating across multiple reports. If you have a report from a provider that you supported the education of, and it didn't get to what you were looking at, it didn't get to your business interests, then maybe just going back as a supporter and looking at why you supported that program, what was the learning objectives, and trying to align that. Maybe there's something there with diagnosis and everything else. So.
Yeah, and sometimes you can lump some things by general theme, even if certain questions aren't as specific as you would like, but they all kind of fall under certain categorical themes. And sometimes there's question items that you would probably just omit, right, from an aggregation across multiple providers or multiple programs because it just doesn't fit, right?
Right. So sometimes it might not fit into the strategic objectives just because that's not part of your strategic objectives right now. And
Right.
Sometimes it might be that, it was a multi-support program and there's just some things that just aren't relevant to you. And I think for the most part, most supporters understand that. They know that. They expect that. But it is a little bit hard sometimes to go through that and try to make that alignment and try to clarify like what is. And sometimes with putting things in buckets, you have to be careful because you don't want to dilute your data. So if you're putting like, a bunch of stuff into an overall treatment bucket, then, adverse effects might be treated differently than sequencing, which might be treated differently than, something else with treatment. And so really, knowing what's going in there and being clear about that is pretty important usually.
If I can't summarize across reports for a general question, what I might sometimes do is look at the responses before the education. And I think sometimes that's very helpful to see which of the distractors get a lot of attention versus the correct answer. And from there, because we know it's not just going to be a one hit and you're done with the education. It requires multiple exposures. So I can pull the baseline data, and share that with my teams.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Anne. I always tend to look at baseline data. I feel like it tells us more because the education is always going to kind of like elevate everybody's understanding and knowledge. And it's pretty clear for the most part that everyone's, kind of ship is rising according to the same tide, right? And within an intervention, some variation between like specialties or something like that. But looking at the distribution of how people come in the door, I think is really helpful and really insightful too. And I feel like a lot of times when you're putting these reports together, everyone just wants to see kind of the low baseline and the high post, and they just want to kind of talk about the accomplishment of the education. But I think some of the just sort of temperature indicators that you get from baseline polling is can be really helpful to the story as well. Just kind of, if this is an indication of what the larger learner group out in the clinician space is like, here are some things that, we want to know about that. So I think that's great.
I have a quick tip and thought, and Angelique, this is something that we discussed previously. We were talking about relevant versus absolute increases. And I have two things about that. So one, when you're reporting, you have to remember that maybe not everybody in your audience really knows what relative versus absolute means. That's one thing. And so if you're providing that to a supporter and then they're providing it to other people internally, they might not know what that means. And the other thing is if you just report your increase, even if it's absolute and you don't report your baseline, then you're really losing some important information there often. So, you know, like Anne says, she likes using the baseline. Also, it kind of tells you where you started. So a 20% increase means something different if the baseline was 20% than if the baseline was 60%. And so really just making sure that you're clarifying that. And the biggest thing is if you report a relative increase, please clarify that it's a relative increase. So, I mean, sometimes it's clear it's 120% increase. It's probably relative, but if it's increase, someone might think it's an absolute, and then it's not great when they go back and they find out that it wasn't. So pretty important to try to make those clarifications. It's not, you know, you're not trying to do information overload and write a whole paragraph or anything, but just percent increase and the baseline, or pre and the post percents aligned to the learning objectives or something like that. So you can still do it, cut it down, provide that. I'm not saying don't provide relative increase. If your audience really likes those relative increases, sure, provide them, but don't lose the context.
Yeah, labeling for sure is really important, whatever, because it becomes a game of telephone. Your report goes, you know, to the supporter or funder, and then they're sharing it internally with other people. And you just want to make sure that all of those labels are there. So, you know, it doesn't get misconstrued, you know, further up the chain.
Okay, great. So we are just about out of time. So I know that there's a lot that we can kind of talk through, and always our outcome sessions, our visualization sessions are always very popular at CME Palooza. So I'm sure we'll kind of get back to these, circle back to these topics again in the future. So just a few housekeeping slides before we wrap up this session. For people who do like free money, CME Palooza is obviously the place to be. We've been giving away lots of things this year. And today we're launching our CME Palooza scavenger hunt. So you just need to go to the website of this special promotion sponsor, Skin, Bones, Hearts, and Private Parts. URL is there on the screen. Look for the CME Palooza, click on it and see what happens. I promise it won't be anything scary. And we also have a survey. There are no prizes with our survey, but we do ask for people to take a look at the survey link and to get a sense of who's watching CME Palooza Fall, what your interests are for the future. And finally, for those people who are watching CME Palooza Live right now, there is no need to refresh your browser to view the next session. Just look on our live page and click the appropriate link. It will start here shortly at the top of the hour. So with that, I would like to thank Angelique and Anne and Bavel and Emily for another great session. And thanks for everyone who watched. And we will see you here in a couple minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.